The transport ship shook once, then settled, and through the round window Nora Bell watched a ring of pale blue light wrap around the hull like a soap bubble catching the sun. She had read about docking fields in her training manuals, but reading about something and feeling it hum through your bones were two very different things. Her fingers tightened on the strap of her bag. Somewhere behind that light was the Kryvex Interstellar Academy, and somewhere inside that academy, she was about to become the strangest thing anyone there had ever seen. She was not a soldier. She was not a diplomat's daughter. She was a 22-year-old woman from a small town, chosen for the exchange program because she had scored high on adaptability tests and because, as the recruiters had said with a strange kind of pity, humanity needed someone to go first. The doors opened, and the smell hit her before the sight did. Metal, ozone, and something like burnt sugar. Then came the academy itself, rising in tiers of black stone and glass, taller than any building she had ever stood beneath. Students of a dozen species moved along the walkways above her, some walking on two legs, some gliding on cushions of air, one enormous creature rolling along on what looked like a wheel made of its own body. Nobody looked at her kindly. A group of tall, gray-skinned students paused near the entrance ramp and watched her pass with open curiosity, the way people might watch an animal that had wandered into a city. One of them said something in a clicking language, and the others laughed. Nora kept walking. She had expected this. She had been warned about this. Humanity's presence in the wider galaxy was less than 2 decades old, and most species out here had histories stretching back thousands of years. To them, humans were newborns. Loud, fast, and unpredictable newborns who had somehow stumbled their way into interstellar contact before they were ready. Counselor Yis met her at the registration hall, a tall being with silver-blue skin and calm, deliberate movements. Yis did not smile, exactly, but there was no hostility in the greeting either. "You are the first," Yis said, checking a datapad. "There have been others accepted, but you arrived before them. That makes you a symbol, whether you wish to be one or not." "I understand," Nora said. "Do you?" Yis studied her for a long moment. "Many here believe your species is not ready for a place like this. Some believe it loudly. You will meet one such believer very soon. Instructor Dravith teaches xenopolitics. It is a required course for all first-year students." Nora nodded, filing the name away. Her room was small but clean, tucked into a wing shared with other exchange students from smaller or newer worlds. Her neighbor, a slim, quick-eyed being named Sella, introduced herself within the first hour, curious rather than hostile, asking rapid questions about human food, human sleep cycles, and whether it was true that humans could survive on almost any planet without special equipment. "Some of us can barely breathe 2 atmospheres over from our home world," Sella said, tapping the small breathing unit at her throat. "You just walked in here breathing the recycled air like it was nothing." "We're stubborn," Nora said, "mostly by accident." Sella laughed, a short clicking sound, and Nora felt the first small thread of ease since she had stepped off the ship. The next morning, Nora walked into Instructor Dravith's classroom 5 minutes early. The room was shaped like a shallow bowl, with rows of seats curving down toward a central platform. Dravith stood there already, arranging his notes, and when he looked up and saw her, something in his expression shifted, a flicker of distaste quickly smoothed over into professional neutrality. He was an older being, his skin a deep bronze, his eyes narrow and pale gold. He had the bearing of someone who had spent decades being listened to without question, and he looked at Nora the way a man might look at a stray that had wandered into his lecture hall. "You must be the human," he said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "Nora Bell," she said, and took a seat near the front, because hiding in the back had never once helped her with anything. The other students filed in, filling the bowl-shaped room with a mixture of species and languages. When the class began, Dravith spoke about the rise and fall of civilizations, using ancient examples from a dozen different worlds. He was, Nora had to admit, a good lecturer. His voice carried, his examples were sharp, and the material was genuinely fascinating. Then, 20 minutes in, he turned the lecture toward what he called young species, and his eyes found Nora without hesitation. "Some species arrive into galactic society already burdened by their own violent instincts," he said, addressing the room, but clearly speaking to her. "They mistake aggression for strength, and impatience for progress. It will be interesting, he added, with the faintest curl of his mouth, to see how such a species adapts to an environment that values patience over noise. A few students turned to look at Nora. She felt the heat rise in her face, but she kept her hands still in her lap and her expression level. She did not answer. She did not need to, not yet. Class ended, and as the room emptied, Sela lingered near the door, waiting for her. That was ugly, Sela said quietly. It was a first day, Nora said. There will be worse. She did not know yet how right she was. 2 weeks passed, and Nora learned the shape of the academy the way she had once learned the shape of a new town. By walking every hallway twice, by watching where the crowds gathered and where they thinned, by noticing which doors stayed locked and which stayed open. She was not the only human on campus anymore. 3 more had arrived, including Toma Reyes, a broad-shouldered young man from a coastal city who treated every insult aimed at humanity as a personal challenge. You just let him say that stuff? Toma asked one evening, as the two of them sat in the shared dining hall, picking at food that was technically edible but tasted like nothing at all. About us being violent? About us being noisy? I let him say it because arguing with him in front of the class does nothing, Nora said. It just makes me look exactly like what he expects. Loud. Reactive. So we just take it? We wait, Nora said. There's a difference. Toma did not look convinced, but he let the matter drop, at least for the moment. The real test came during a class debate, held once every 2 weeks in Dravatha's course, where students were split into groups and made to argue different sides of a historical question. This time, the topic was species hierarchy within galactic law, an old and uncomfortable subject that most instructors handled carefully. Dravath did not handle it carefully. He handled it like a scalpel. He divided the room into groups and assigned positions, and when he reached Nora's group, he paused. Your group will argue, he said, that some species are, by their nature, better suited to leadership roles than others. Use examples from history. His pale gold eyes settled on Nora. Ms. Bell, perhaps you can speak first, using your own species as a case study. I imagine you have considerable material to work with. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when everyone is trying not to look like they are listening. Nora felt Sela stiffen beside her. Toma, 2 rows back, half rose out of his seat before catching himself. Nora stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not stumble. She spoke about early human history, about tribal conflicts and the slow, painful climb toward cooperation, and she did it with the same flat honesty a historian might use to describe any species past, including, she pointed out calmly, most of the species currently in the room. Every civilization here, she said, including yours, instructor, has a history of conflict before it found peace. Humanity is simply newer to this stage. That is not the same as being unsuited to it. Dravatha's expression did not change much, but something behind his eyes did. He had wanted her flustered. He had wanted a show of temper he could point to as proof. Instead, he got a calm, precise answer that left him with nothing solid to grab onto. An interesting perspective, he said finally, though perhaps a generous one, given the timeline in question. He moved on to the next group, but the mood in the room had shifted, just slightly. A few students who had been watching with detached curiosity now looked at Nora with something closer to interest. After class, Sela caught up with her in the hallway, walking fast to match Nora's pace. You didn't even blink, Sela said. He was trying to bait you in front of everyone, and you just answered him like it was a normal question. It was a normal question, Nora said. He just asked it for the wrong reasons. Doesn't that make you angry? Nora considered the question honestly before answering. It makes me tired, she said. But anger is what he wants from me. If I give him that, he wins twice. Once for the insult, and once for proving his point. Sela went quiet, turning that over in her mind. Around them, the hallway was filling with students changing between classes, dozens of species moving in a current of noise and motion, and for a moment Nora felt very small inside it. One human among so many others who did not yet believe she belonged. That evening, Toma found her in the study hall, dropping into the seat across from her with the particular energy of someone who had been holding words in for hours. People are talking about it, he said. About the debate. Some of them think you handled it well. A couple of them think you should have torn into him. Tearing into him wouldn't have changed anything, Nora said. not looking up from her notes. It would have given him a story to tell. The angry human who couldn't control herself when challenged. I'm not interested in giving him that story. So what are you interested in? Nora finally looked up, and there was something steady and unhurried in her expression, the look of someone already several steps ahead in a game most people around her did not know they were playing. I'm interested in what he does next, she said. Men like him don't stop after one insult. They escalate when they don't get the reaction they want. I'd rather be ready for that than surprised by it. Toma opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, because there was nothing in her words he could really disagree with. Outside the tall windows of the study hall, the artificial night of the academy deepened, distant lights flickering on across the towers like scattered stars, and somewhere in another part of the building, Instructor Dravith sat alone in his office, staring at nothing, already deciding that a calm human was a more dangerous problem than a loud one. The strategy simulation lab sat in the lower levels of the academy, a wide circular room ringed with glowing terminals, where students practiced managing resources, negotiations, and crisis scenarios in conditions designed to feel as real as possible without any real danger attached. Nora had expected to struggle here. Instead, she found something close to comfort. The simulations rewarded exactly the kind of thinking she had grown up doing without a name for it. Watching patterns, weighing small decisions before they became big problems, staying calm when everything around her wanted her to panic. Where other students often reacted quickly and adjusted later, Nora tended to pause, study the board, and act only once, but with precision that usually outperformed 3 hasty moves combined. Within a month, her simulation scores were posted publicly on the lab's ranking board, and her name sat near the very top, above students from species with centuries of formal strategic training behind them. It did not take long for people to notice. "You're second in the entire first-year class," Sella said one afternoon, reading the board over Nora's shoulder with wide, impressed eyes. "Second, out of everyone." "It's just numbers on a screen," Nora said, though she couldn't fully hide the small satisfaction in her voice. "It's not just numbers to them," Sella said, nodding toward a cluster of older students who were staring at the board with expressions that ranged from surprised to openly annoyed. "A lot of species here take their standing very seriously. Someone new outperforming them, especially someone from a species most of them look down on, that's going to bother people." Nora had already guessed as much. What she had not expected was how quickly the discomfort would reach Instructor Dravith. He stopped her after class the following week, waiting until the room had emptied before speaking, his voice low and controlled in a way that felt more threatening than any shout could have been. "You are drawing a great deal of attention, Ms. Bell," he said. "More than I think is wise for someone in your position. I'm just doing the coursework, Instructor. You are outperforming students whose families have shaped galactic policy for generations," he said. "Some of them do not take that lightly. Neither, frankly, do I." He stepped closer, his pale gold eyes fixed on her without blinking. "I have taught at this academy for a very long time. I have seen careers begin here, and I have seen them end here. It would be a simple matter for me to find irregularities in your coursework. Academic misconduct, falsified records, things that would see you removed long before you had the chance to embarrass anyone further." Nora felt something cold settle in her chest, but she did not let it show on her face. "Are you threatening me, Instructor?" "I am advising you," he said, "to know your place. This academy has existed for longer than your species has understood spaceflight. It does not need to be reshaped to make room for a newcomer's pride." He straightened, smoothing the front of his robe. "Consider this a courtesy. I do not extend it twice." He turned and walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Nora standing alone in the empty classroom, her hands curled at her sides. She did not chase after him. She did not raise her voice to the empty room. She stood very still for a long moment, replaying his words carefully, memorizing them the way she might memorize a difficult passage in a textbook, because she understood, even in that first shock of anger, that what had just happened was not simply an insult. It was evidence. That night, she told no one what had happened, not even Sella, not even Toma. She sat alone in her small room, staring at the ceiling, and let herself feel the anger fully, all at once, in private, where it could not be used against her. She let her hands shake. She let her breathing go tight and uneven. She allowed herself exactly 1 hour of that. Then she opened her data pad, and her hands grew steady again. She began, very quietly, to think. Dravith had made a mistake, and it was not the threat itself, though that was serious enough. His mistake was believing that a calm response meant a passive one. He had assumed that because she had not shouted, she would simply fold. He did not understand, could not understand, that for some people, silence was not surrender. It was preparation. She thought about what Counselor Yis had said to her on the very first day. You will meet one such believer very soon. Yis had known about Dravith's reputation, or at least suspected it, and had chosen to warn her rather than intervene directly. That told her something important. The Academy's leadership was not blind to Dravith's behavior. It simply had never been forced to look at it directly. If she wanted to be safe here, shouting at Dravith would accomplish nothing except confirming his low opinion of her. But if she could show the Academy, clearly and undeniably, exactly what kind of instructor he was, that was a different matter entirely. She would need proof, not just of tonight's threat, but of a pattern. Men who threaten one student rarely stopped at one. If Dravith had done this before, somewhere in the Academy's long memory, there would be a trace of it. Nora closed her eyes, took a slow breath, and began making a list. She was no longer thinking about surviving Dravith's class. She was thinking about ending his career. The Academy's public archive was open to all students, a vast digital library holding decades of records, course histories, disciplinary notes, and old announcements. Most students used it to research assignments. Nora used it, over the following 2 weeks, to build a case. She started small, careful not to draw attention. During free periods, instead of joining Toma and the other humans in the common room, she sat in the far corner of the archive, headset on, quietly searching through old academic bulletins. She was looking for one thing in particular: any record of a student leaving Dravith's course, or leaving the Academy altogether, under circumstances that seemed unclear. It was slow work. Records from smaller or newer species were often thin, sometimes barely more than a name and a date, since the Academy had, for most of its history, cared little about documenting the struggles of students it considered unimportant. But thin was not the same as empty, and Nora had patience most people her age did not. She found the first name in the 3rd week, a student from a small waterworld species, enrolled in Dravith's course 6 years earlier, who had withdrawn from the Academy midterm with no official reason given. Nora cross-referenced the withdrawal date with old course attendance logs and found a 2-week gap in that student's simulation participation right before the withdrawal, the exact kind of gap that usually followed a formal warning or an academic threat. It was not proof, not yet, but it was a thread. She found Sella in the dining hall that evening and asked her, carefully, whether she knew anyone from a smaller species who had studied under Dravith in past years. Sella thought about it for a long moment, then mentioned a cousin of a friend, someone who had graduated 2 years earlier and now worked in a records office 2 levels down from the Academy's main hall. Why do you want to know? Sella asked. I'm trying to understand a pattern, Nora said, which was true, if incomplete. Sella studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if she had decided not to ask further questions yet. Through Sella's connection, Nora reached the former student, a quiet, careful being named Doss, who agreed to speak with her over a private channel. At first, Doss was hesitant, giving short, guarded answers. But when Nora explained, honestly, what had happened to her in Dravith's classroom, something in Doss's tone changed. He did the same thing to me, Doss said. Not the same words, but the same shape. I did well in a class. He didn't like it. He told me, privately, that my scores would be reviewed for irregularities if I didn't moderate my participation. I was 18. I didn't know what to do. I stopped raising my hand in class. My scores dropped. Eventually, I transferred out of his course entirely. Would you be willing to say that to Counselor Yis? Nora asked. Officially, there was a long pause. I don't know, Doss said. It was a long time ago. I understand if you can't, Nora said. But if there are others, and I think there might be, a pattern is harder to ignore than one story. Doss did not agree immediately, but did not refuse either, and that was enough for Nora to keep working. Over the following days, Doss quietly reached out to a few other former students, people who had once studied under Dravith and left the course, or the Academy, under circumstances that had never quite made sense at the time. Slowly, carefully, 3 more accounts came forward, each one different in its details, but strikingly similar in its shape. A student performing well, a private warning from Dravith, a threat wrapped in professional language, and a quiet retreat that followed. None of them, on their own, would have been enough. Dravith was careful. He never made his threats in writing, never left anything that could be pulled up as direct evidence. But Nora was not building her case on a single document. She was building it the way she had learned to build everything else in her life, one small, verified piece at a time, until the shape of the whole thing became impossible to ignore. She requested, through the Academy's public record system, formal access to Dravith's disciplinary history as an instructor, a request any student was technically allowed to make, though almost none ever did. It took 3 days to process. What came back was thin on paper, but Nora had learned enough by then to read the gaps as clearly as the words. For formal reviews requested against him over the years, all 4 closed with no action taken, each one closed within a suspiciously short window of time, each one lacking any recorded testimony from the students involved. Someone, at some point, had made sure those reviews went nowhere. Nora sat with that information for a long time, turning it over in her mind. She thought of Dravith's calm, certain voice in the empty classroom. Consider this a courtesy. I do not extend it twice. He had been so confident that no one would challenge him, because no one ever had, not successfully, not in a way that stuck. She would be the first. She gathered everything she had, the withdrawal records, Doss's testimony, the 3 additional accounts, the pattern of closed reviews, and organized it all into a single, careful file, the way she might have organized evidence for any project, methodical and unemotional on the surface, even though beneath it sat something sharper and more determined than she let herself show. Then she requested a formal hearing before Counselor Yiss and the Academy Board. It was granted for the following week. Word of the hearing spread through the Academy faster than Nora expected. She had requested it quietly, through proper channels, without telling anyone beyond Sella, Toma, and Doss. But formal hearings involving instructors were rare, and rarer still when requested by a first-year student. By the time the day arrived, the hearing hall was full, students packed into the gallery seats above the main floor, whispering in a dozen languages, watching the empty central platform with open curiosity. Nora stood near the front, her data pad in hand, wearing the plainest clothes she owned, nothing that could be mistaken for a performance. Toma sat in the front row of the gallery, arms crossed, jaw tight, ready to be angry on her behalf if she needed him to be. Sella sat beside him, quieter, watching Nora with an expression somewhere between worry and pride. Instructor Dravith arrived a few minutes later, composed and unhurried, greeting a few of the board members with easy familiarity as he took his place across the platform from Nora. He looked, if anything, faintly amused, the expression of someone who believed he already knew how this would end. Counselor Yiss entered last, taking a seat at the head of the board table, flanked by 3 other senior instructors. Yiss's expression gave nothing away. This hearing is called, Yiss said, at the formal request of student Nora Bell, regarding conduct by instructor Dravith. The student may present her case. Nora stepped forward. Her heart was beating fast, but her voice, when it came, was steady. 6 weeks ago, she said, Instructor Dravith told me, privately, that if I continued to perform well in his coursework, he would falsify academic misconduct charges against me to have me removed from this academy. He framed it as advice. It was a threat. A ripple of murmurs moved through the gallery. Dravith's expression did not change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. A serious accusation, Yiss said, and one that, without evidence, is simply one student's word against an instructor's. Do you have evidence, Ms. Bell? I do, Nora said. She activated her data pad, and the images and files it held projected onto the central display for the whole room to see. She began with the withdrawal record from 6 years earlier, walking the board through the gap in attendance, the timing, the pattern. Then she brought up Doss's recorded testimony, followed by the 3 additional accounts gathered from former students, each one describing the same shape of thread in different words. Finally, she displayed the 4 disciplinary reviews filed against Dravith over the years, each one closed within days, each one missing any recorded testimony. For separate complaints, Nora said, closed without investigation. 5 former students, myself included, describing the same pattern of private threats used to silence high-performing students who threatened Instructor Dravith's authority in his own classroom. I am not asking this board to take my word alone. I am asking this board to look at the pattern. For the first time, Dravith's composure cracked, just slightly, a tightening around his eyes. "This is a fabrication," he said, his voice sharp. "A collection of rumors and disgruntled former students, stitched together to attack my reputation. I have taught at this academy for over 30 years. My record speaks for itself." "Your record," Nora said, "shows 4 complaints closed without proper review. That is not a defense, instructor. That is part of the pattern." "You are a first-year student," Dravith snapped, some of his careful control slipping away. "You do not understand how this institution works. You do not understand the standards that built it, standards your species has not yet earned the right to question." "I understand the Academy's own governing charter," Nora said calmly, "which states that any instructor found to have used threats of falsified misconduct to suppress a student's academic performance is subject to immediate review and removal, regardless of tenure or species." She looked directly at him. "I read it twice, instructor, to make sure I understood it correctly before I stood here today." The room had gone very quiet. Dravith opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, visibly recalculating, searching for an angle that was no longer there. He turned to the board, to Counselor Yis, his voice regaining some of its old authority. "Counselor, surely you see this for what it is. A young species, eager to prove itself, manufacturing a controversy to gain attention." Yis studied him for a long moment before responding, and when the words came, they were slow and deliberate. "I see 5 separate students, from 5 different species, describing the same behavior across 6 years, Yis said. "I see disciplinary reviews closed without proper process. I see a governing charter clearly outlining the consequences for exactly this kind of conduct." Yis paused. "What I do not see, Instructor Dravith, is a defense." The silence that followed was total. Even the usual background hum of the hall's ventilation seemed to fade beneath it. Dravith stood very still, his pale gold eyes moving once across the gallery, across the rows of students watching him, before settling, briefly, on Nora. There was no threat left in that look, only the beginning of understanding. Counselor Yis turned to the other board members, spoke a few quiet words, and then faced the room once more. "This board will take the evidence presented under formal review," Yis said. "Instructor Dravith is suspended from all teaching duties, effective immediately, pending the outcome." Dravith said nothing. He simply stood, gathered the remains of his composure as best he could, and walked out of the hall, the sound of his footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence he left behind him. The formal review took 9 days. Nora spent most of them the same way she spent every other week at the academy, attending classes, working through simulation exercises, eating quiet meals with Sella and Toma in the dining hall, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. But the academy around her had changed, in small ways that added up to something larger. Students she had never spoken to nodded to her in the hallways now. A few of the older students who had once watched her ranking on the simulation board with open annoyance began, instead, to ask her questions after class, about her strategies, about how she had approached certain scenarios. Even the gray-skinned group that had laughed at her on her very first day, the ones who had watched her walk off the transport ship like an animal that had wandered somewhere it did not belong, no longer laughed. One of them, a tall, quiet student named Ferek, stopped her in the corridor one afternoon. "I did not expect a human to out-argue Instructor Dravith in front of the entire board," Ferek said, with the careful bluntness of someone used to admitting he had been wrong. "I have revised my expectations." "That's all I ever wanted," Nora said. Not applause, just a fair look. Ferek studied her for a moment, then gave a short nod and walked on, and Nora understood that this, small and quiet as it was, mattered more than any dramatic victory could have. On the 10th day, Counselor Yis called Nora to a private meeting, not a public hearing this time. Just the two of them in Yis's office, a calm, orderly room lined with data crystals and old academy records. "The board has reached its decision," Yis said. "Instructor Dravith's teaching license has been permanently revoked. The 4 prior complaints against him have been reopened, and the students involved, including the one you called DOS, are being offered formal acknowledgement and, where possible, restored academic standing. Thank you for taking it seriously, Nora said. I did not do this as a favor to you, Yis said, not unkindly. I did it because the evidence demanded it. That is precisely why it worked. Had you come to me with anger alone, I could not have acted, whatever I personally believed. You gave me something undeniable instead. Yis paused, studying her the way an instructor studies a particularly interesting piece of work. Where did you learn to build a case like that? It was not part of your coursework. Nora thought about it honestly before answering. I grew up in a place where you didn't win arguments by being the loudest person in the room, she said. You won them by being the person who had actually done the work. I suppose I never unlearned that. Yis made a small sound that might, in a human, have been something close to a laugh. A useful trait. I suspect this academy will see more of your species in the coming years. If they are anything like you, they will change how many of us think about newer worlds. Nora left the office feeling lighter than she had in weeks, though not triumphant, not exactly. She walked back through the tall corridors of the academy, past the ranking boards, past classrooms full of unfamiliar languages, and found Toma and Sella waiting for her outside the dining hall, both of them trying, unsuccessfully, to look casual about the fact that they had clearly been waiting there for some time. Well, Toma asked, unable to hold back any longer. He's gone, Nora said. For good. Toma let out a breath he had apparently been holding since the hearing, and Sella's clicking laugh rang out, drawing a few curious glances from passing students. You know, Sella said, when I first met you, I thought humans were interesting because you were new. Strange, unfamiliar, worth studying. She shook her head slowly. I don't think that anymore. I think you're interesting because of what you actually do. That's a nicer compliment than most people mean it to be, Nora said. That evening, Nora sat by the tall window in her small room, looking out over the academy grounds, the artificial night settling gently over the towers, distant lights flickering across 1,000 windows belonging to 1,000 different lives. She thought about the frightened, uncertain feeling she'd carried off that transport ship weeks ago, the sense of being the strangest thing anyone here had ever seen. She still was, in some ways. Humanity was still new. Still learning the shape of this larger galaxy, still making mistakes, still being watched and judged, and occasionally underestimated. That would not change overnight, and she did not expect it to. But something had shifted, quietly, in a room full of students who had once looked at her as an oddity and now looked at her as something else entirely. Not because she had shouted, not because she had fought back with noise or force, the very things Dravith had once accused her species of being built for. She had won by being patient, by being careful, by treating an insult not as a wound to nurse, but as a problem to be solved, one piece of evidence at a time, until the truth became too heavy for anyone to ignore. Humanity, she thought, watching the lights of the academy stretch out toward the dark curve of the horizon, might be young in this galaxy. But young did not mean foolish, and quiet did not mean weak. Somewhere out there, more humans were coming, more exchange students, more scientists, more diplomats, stepping off ships just as she had, into rooms full of strangers who did not yet understand what they were dealing with. Nora smiled slightly and let the silence of the room settle around her, comfortable now instead of foreign, and allowed herself, for the first time since arriving, to simply feel that she belonged.